Hello and welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson and I'm joined today by my co-hosts Heather Dinwoody and Julia Bottaro. As ever, we'll be talking about some of the most important stories of the week. Julia, can we start with your story today?
Yes, absolutely. Today I have a positive story from the startup world. The Swedish company called Sire, which means oxygen in Swedish, has just raised $100 million for its Series A round, which is quite big, especially for a European startup. So this company does textile recycling, and it's been backed by companies such as H&M, IKEA, and Volvo. So I think this story is really interesting because earlier this year, RenewCell, which was another textile recycling startup, collapsed. And that was a really big shock for the industry because RenewCell was sort of like the poster child of how to do textile recycling. And, there were lots of reasons, including the fact that there were problems to scale. So Sire is presenting itself as a company that wants to scale immediately. So instead of going from a small testing batch to a larger one to then scale up slowly, they just want to do it fast because, as we know, the fashion industry is very polluting and there is plenty of textile waste out there to recycle, and we need to find solutions fast. And so it's raised all this money. It will build 2 large recycling plants in Iberia and Vietnam. And I think that the companies that have invested that I mentioned before are quite interesting because polyester is being used in fashion, so H&M, but also in furniture, so IKEA, and cars, which is Volvo. So it would be really interesting to see if this company succeeds. I think one thing to be said is that companies in the fashion world always have good intentions and
Always have good intentions.
well, I don't know. That was phrased wrongly. I mean, they have ideas that they show to the public. The pledges. They have the pledges. Whether
The pledges.
whether they follow up on them or not. They have their beautiful targets, but reaching them is a bit of a faff. So then they decide to not reach. So you know what I mean? It'll be interesting to see if someone actually follows through on the promise of doing textile more sustainably.
It's just one of the things that's really unusual about this is the concept of going from small to large scale really, really quickly. It almost feels like, especially with $100 million Series A, it feels like a high-tech Silicon Valley kind of investment. You said it yourself, it's unusual for a European company to raise a Series A at that level, unless it's AI. So, obviously the companies that are backing the startup really believe that this can happen and happen fast, which is fascinating.
I think it is fascinating because I've heard of quite a few sort of textile recycling startups. It's not impossible, which I think for a lot of people tend to assume that textiles, particularly these ones that are sort of a mix of natural textiles and synthetic textiles, a lot of people just don't think it is possible or economically viable to do that recycling. And to have someone who says that they're ready to scale up is really exciting.
I think what's potentially really interesting is the fact that it's Harold Mix, the guy who's behind quite a lot of interesting startups, and the fact that the money's been raised to close the acquisition of the technology, the depolymerization technology, because that's actually saying we've actually analyzed and assessed the most effective technologies out there. We think this is the one that's going to work. So putting a large amount of money behind a tested and assessed technology is potentially a really smart way to get to that rapid scale that you were talking about.
Yeah, instead of starting from scratch. Yeah, actually, I forgot to say earlier in the description of the story that the people behind the project spent some time analyzing various textile recycling technologies across the world, and they picked one from a university in the US. And so their first recycling facility was actually in the US. So yeah, as you said, just sort of betting on the winner, hopefully. I think one important point to remember here is that this is great there is plenty of textile waste out there to recycle. We need to do something with it because it ends up in landfill, it pollutes the environment, sometimes it gets burned. There aren't good solutions when you're just throwing it away. So turning into new textiles to then put again in the system is a good solution. However, it should not be seen as a reason to continue producing polyester, which can be the case sometimes when we find solutions such as recycling. So the fashion industry should keep working, or maybe start working on reducing its overproduction levels. So I would say that for me would be the main takeaway from this story. But at the same time, it is great to see this appetite from investors in innovative technologies. So yeah, all the best to Sire.
Heather, what's your story for us today?
So I wanted to talk today about a review that has just come out by Reuters. They've been reviewing some data from the UN and the OECD on the delivery of climate finance. So as we all know, the developed countries is the going term, or high income countries, whatever you want to call them, had pledged to deliver $100 billion per year of climate finance to their lower income counterparts. And this review shows that within that time, at least 18 billion of loans have been made under this climate finance label, but they've been delivered with market rate interest. So Japan was responsible for the most, with 10.2 billion in market rate loans. The sort of next biggest one was France with 3.6 billion. But we know that if this is climate finance that has been pledged to support people, it's been pledged as kind of compensation for the damage that has been done by higher income countries to lower income countries, you should really be paying low interest at most, or no interest at all. There was also, on top of that, there was 11 billion in grants that came with the condition of the receiving countries had to purchase supplies or hire services from the giving country. So that was 11 billion, mostly from Japan. But then there was another 10.6 billion in grants, which was from 24 different countries in total, which came with the requirement that the receiving country had to hire someone from the donor country to do the work that the grant was being awarded for. So basically what you've ended up with is a system where this supposed climate finance aid for the most vulnerable countries in the world is just paying back into the economies of the richer countries, who are supposed to be sort of giving compensation and making up for their historic emissions. And at the moment, it has sort of created a really unfair pit of despair, I'm going to call it. So most of the loans are going to middle income countries, whereas low income countries, most of the climate finance they receive is sort of unconditional or very, very low interest. But because rich countries can't benefit of them as much, they're getting a lot less support than these middle income countries, who will then have to pay back higher. And I sort of thought it was quite pertinent that this is happening at the very same time as we've got the small island developing states happening in Barbuda and Antigua. So that's basically all of the small island states. I think there's 39 of them in total, getting together to say we need help because they are so burdened by debt, and then they're being hit the worst by rising sea levels, rising temperatures, the same as everyone else in the world, but 10 times worse and 10 times faster. Those aren't exact statistics. And while they're sort of desperately gathering, trying to figure a way out of the mess that they're in, rich countries are only making it worse. And I just think it's really despicable. And COP29, we've got, I believe, a new climate finance goal is due to be set. And I'm just really hoping that we can do something better this time.
Well, I think there's some really interesting points here. I think it's really important to separate out the different types of climate finance, because you talked about compensation, for the damage that countries have done. That's actually something that comes under loss and damage, which is a very specific thing about providing funds to make up for the losses caused by the actions of industrialized countries. Climate finance is slightly different. That's the thing that's been agreed under the climate negotiations. But I think what you're pointing out about, high interest loans, the trouble of conditional grants, a lot of this is, I think, to do with the way the financial system works. This idea that everything has become financialized, and what used to be grants that were given to countries to try and work on their mitigation strategies or adapt to climate change have actually become something where loans are provided. Now, they might be low interest loans, but they're still debt that's got to be paid back. And you can't look around anywhere without realizing that debt repayments are one of the biggest burdens on many developing economies. And if you add to that in any way, you have a serious, serious problem. There's also the issue that these more vulnerable countries often have very high sovereign credit risk ratings, often actually because of climate risk. So that even if they're borrowing money as a country, they're doing it at 10 times the cost of one of the industrialized countries. I think Germany managed to finance its development bank at 0% interest on the international markets, because debt is about people's belief that you'll be able to pay it back. So if you've got a situation where you've got vulnerable countries massively under attack from climate change, and the finance they're being offered is conditional or debt related, you're actually complicating the burden they have to deal with. There's a reason why the 90s was a big era for talking about getting, forgiving debt, because economies find it very hard to function with a high burden of debt, especially in an era of high interest rates. And when you consider how much we actually have to do in terms of mitigation and adaptation, the inflation levels we actually have globally, and the fact that we need to actually start making dramatic changes by 2030, you start thinking climate finance isn't doing the job it needs to do. But I suppose the question is that because of the system it's operating within? Do we need to look at things in a different way?
Well, if you keep exploiting the system this way, then you're going to eventually end up in a world where, everyone is struggling to pay their debt back, and that eventually leads to defaults. So they might as well have just given the finance anyway.
Yeah, no, I would pay money to see you pitching that idea to the IMF, for example, or the Green Investment Bank, or yeah, fantastic.
Oh, I mean, I would just tell them that money is all numbers on screens and it doesn't mean anything anyway, so why not help a gal out? Just that's my approach.
World leaders, are you listening? Please give the finance anyway. Thanks. Are there any discussions about forgiving debt now, or was it just a thing of the 90s?
There's lots of discussions about it. And I think under the Bridgetown Initiative, there's explorations of how you might change the Bretton Woods system, which is the system we've really had since the Second World War that was, set up to ensure economic stability. But obviously, countries don't want to forgive debt. Investors don't want to forgive debt. They want to keep making the money they're making on the back of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds, from what Heather was saying about the study, it just feels like the industrialized countries continue to have their cake and eat it because they are responsible for the vast majority of historical emissions. And then the ones that are bearing the burden are, the poorer countries. But this system just doesn't seem to work.
Okay, well, I think that's a great note to actually bring up my story, because my story isn't that newsy, but I do think it's really important. There is a real difference between newsy and important. And I think one of the stories that we try to cover is to talk about how things might change. So last week was the International Day for Biodiversity. And on that day, the Business for Nature Coalition announced the first 5 businesses whose nature strategies have been reviewed and accepted into what it calls the It's Now for Nature campaign. This was launched at, I think, just before COP28. So last year in 2023. Basically, what it's talking about is that at COP15, which is the nature COP, not the climate COP, governments committed through Target 15 that they were going to require all large businesses and financial institutions to assess and disclose their risks, impacts and dependencies on nature. Now, the reason I think this is really exciting is it's important in and of itself, but it's also a way of taking another look at impacts around climate. So on the most basic level, when we're talking about nature, we have a situation where I think half the world's GDP is dependent, either highly dependent or dependent on nature. That's a huge amount of risk. I think it's $18 trillion at risk every year from not dealing with nature properly. And these are things like looking at long-term value, looking at the problems. Nature fundamentally underpins the global economy. There are interlinked natural systems across water and air and land, and they're fundamental to our ability to function. Even if you don't think about it in terms of a public good and the fact that we need nature for clean air and clean water and food, at the same time, if you're a business, there's risk around procurement, around the supply chain. If you start looking at a risk profile, what are the potential nature-related risks? So what the Business for Nature campaign is doing is saying companies need to have a credible strategy for nature. They've basically set out a series of criteria for the nature strategy to be credible and ambitious. And it needs a materiality assessment. It needs targets that are aligned with material impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. It's got to have actions to achieve those targets, in particular to avoid and reduce negative impacts on nature. And of course, C-suite or board approval of the strategy. These first 5 were submitted and accepted, and they were GSK, Caring, Anvec Limited, NG, and bizarrely the Taiwan Cement Corporation. Now, 5 doesn't seem like much when you consider that the COP15 overall goal was the protection of 30% of all nature by 2030. But the idea behind the campaign, and they have this thing called the Business Handbook for Nature, is to provide a showcase for who's doing what and how they can do it, and to help companies understand how they can address nature and climate risk and, what they actually need to do. And that's to integrate nature into their environmental strategies. But that means their climate strategies and their overall resilience strategies and their ability to develop for the future. So I know they're working on getting some more strategies announced before the end of the year, because obviously we have the next Nature COP is at the end of this year in Colombia. But I think it's incredibly exciting that there is this recognition of the importance of nature, recognition of the fact that this is a fundamental business issue for a lot of businesses. For GSK, for example, they're a healthcare company. They operate in places where the interconnection of water and land exists. There are really interesting ideas about biodiversity protection, but one of the things I think is most exciting about companies getting serious about nature is that it's something far more tangible for people to engage with. To a certain extent, talking about climate change, and the things that need to happen, and system change and energy mitigation and CO2 emissions, they're quite distant, I think, for a lot of people. But when you look at nature and go, this wildflower meadow is here because this strategy has changed, that we have recovered water and the area around our factory is cleaner and greener. These are all really specific things that people can feel and touch and engage with and see. And I think it's also really interesting because it potentially opens the door to collaboration in a completely different way. Because if you are thinking about water and your actions on water, obviously what one company does may not make that difference. But if you think about it on a water basin level, and you have this idea that companies can work together to actually transform the environment in which they operate in a way that creates longevity of supply for themselves, but also local benefits, community benefits, for some reason, I just see it as this perfect circular opportunity to do better and do it in a way where everybody wins.
Yes, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I wanted to do a little bit of promotion of our podcast because we had a conversation about a very similar topic on the 1st of May with Nala Earth, which is a startup dealing with nature. So people can go and listen to that if they want. But I was thinking that, you were talking about examples of companies that are doing well. So Caring, I think Caring is a big, in the sustainability world is probably one of the most uploaded for its commitment to nature. And I think it is important to provide examples. And, maybe some small businesses are listening to us. And, even if you're a small business, you can still take inspiration from a large corporation because, I think with emissions, it's a bit more immediate what companies can do, while with nature, because it's unique to each single area. Even if you have two factories in two different countries, their impacts are going to be slightly different. So you need to be a little bit more creative as a company to understand what your impacts and dependencies on nature are. And so I think providing examples can be a great starting point. And there are a lot of frameworks out there to understand how to begin your journey. And I think it's really important and really need to talk about it more. And I'm glad we're already talking about it a few weeks after the previous interview, because there is all this focus on carbon, on emissions, and the 30 target is in less than 6 years' time. So we really need to step up action quite quickly. We can't really afford to ignore it.
I also think, but there's also that thing, as you were saying, of carbon emissions is one thing. It's a first step. There's so much more to do. And I think I'll add some links in the show notes about some places to look for information on what you would do with it, how to create a nature strategy. Because I know the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has been working with GSK to develop a nature sector roadmap for the pharmaceutical industry. So, this is something which can help you prioritize actions that you can take. And those actions can significantly improve both your business resilience and your environmental sustainability. So to me, the idea that you can prepare, you can get ahead of reporting that we know is coming down the line because it's been agreed at a global level. It works for preparing for reporting. It works for internal risk management, and it works for basically just being decent.
And as you said, we all have a relationship with nature. Even the most hardcore city people may have a plant in their living room, or appreciate the Sunday in the park. So, we can really see it tangibly. And I think nature outcomes can be more tangible than emissions. Emissions are just air. So they can be hard to see them unless you're obviously, breathing into traffic. So, we all want a greener world. So let's work for it.
And I think that is a perfect note to end this part of the podcast on. We do all want a greener world. We want a cleaner world, and we want one that we can all live in happily. So thanks again for this morning, and we'll be right back. Hello, and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Harriet Kingerby, one of the founders of the Conscious Ad Network. Welcome, Harriet. I wondered if we could kick off, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in the Conscious Ad Network.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. I set up the Conscious Advertising Network about 5 years ago with my co-founder, Jake Dubbins. I came from the world of corporate sustainability. So I've been helping kind of large organizations to work out how they showed up around really, really important issues for a long time. And I took a bit of a career break and started writing about advertising technology as part of my journey of self-exploration. And what I couldn't get over was the way that I've been taught to build brands and what sustainability added to brands and that long-term thinking. I couldn't square that with the way that the advertising technology world was viewing kind of brand building and performance, kind of performance marketing and things like that. And it just seemed so diametrically opposed to me. And that started a number of questions in my mind. And when I met Jake, I think he had been running an advertising agency for quite a long time and was struggling with similar problems, but also from a kind of human rights and ethical dimension. And so the Conscious Advertising Network was born. We have had many iterations of our kind of thematic manifestos over the last 5 years. And those things cover everything from hate speech and misinformation right through to climate change and sustainability. They look at righting some of the, the human rights kind of harms that advertising is inadvertently causing. And they help advertisers to really understand how they can essentially clean up their digital supply chains. And for me, it's a real passion project, because as I've got into this, I've started to realize just how much advertising and the health of our information environment, and we can talk about this more in a bit, but just how important that is for us, not only commercially, because we are working with advertisers, but also how important that is in terms of the conversations that we're having around the issues that really, really affect how we're living today. So I'm talking about climate change. I'm talking about human rights. I'm talking about things like, kind of migration, for example. And so for me, this is it's a huge passion project, and really does cut across lots of the issues that I find really, really, really important.
Well, I think this is a fascinating topic, because I think one of the things that's come up a lot in the climate space over the last 20 years is that discussion of, if the world's advertisers use the power that they have to change people's minds about what to buy, to change people's minds about how to behave, or to educate them about what's really going on in the world might be a very different place. So what exactly does the Conscious Advertising Network do? Sort of, how does it actually work?
Right. So we talk about advertisers being the architects of desire, but there's two elements to the way that advertisers influence, kind of national narratives around topics. So the first one is absolutely the content that and what we see on screen, or what we see on those billboards, the messaging, the imagery that comes with the advertising. Because that helps us to, I think it helps us to frame topics in a way that might be important to us. If we cast up those adverts right, we can show representation. We can do all sorts of things with what people see. But there's another element to how advertising, I guess, influences our national narratives, and that's through media spend, and actually what advertising ends up funding. So if you work in advertising at the moment, everyone is talking about something called made for advertising sites. We will all have seen them when we scroll through our, kind of maybe our social media feeds. There'll be the kind of quite clickbaity headlines, and we go through, and there's kind of maybe some silly content, maybe some shocking content. Sometimes there's some really misinformative or misogynistic content, because that stuff unfortunately performs quite well. And these sites have been set up essentially just for advertisers to place their advertising on. They don't really get that much human traffic, but they do, I guess, but they do get a lot of bot traffic. And so they look like good places to have your advertising. And the problem is rubbish like that, because it's not quality information that's being on it. Let's be honest. The number of those sites is rapidly increasing. Not only that, but, there has been a change towards making content more salacious over the last, 15 years, since digital advertising became the primary funder of many of our news outlets and spaces. And so what's happening is you have this kind of degradation of information and degradation of our news spaces online. You have hate and misinformation, for example, have a funding model through advertising, because when you've got content that gets a lot of reaction on things like social media, it sends signals to those sites that content is worth serving to more people, because it will get more of a reaction. And what we have created by not thinking carefully about where we spend our media spend is, in fact, this explosion in misinformation and hate and frankly, kind of online junk. And advertisers also are not thinking very carefully about what they should fund. So we have bad advertising technology that's essentially defunding large swathes of not only hard news, because we've had an explosion of people not wanting their brand to appear next to kind of crunchy topics, but also there's some technology that will block entire kind of media outlets from particular communities, because, for example, brands have words like Muslim on block lists. And so media spend is the other way that advertisers actually do influence our national narratives. And that's the other thing the Conscious Advertising Network looks at. So not just what's on screen, but also, kind of those media ecosystems there. And the way it works is that we ask advertisers to sign up and audit the way that they work. So we have written these 7 manifestos that cover hate speech, misinformation, children's well-being, ad fraud, consent, stuff like that. Advertisers then audit what they're doing, and they create a roadmap So we don't ask for perfection. We ask for a roadmap of how they can improve against our manifestos. And then they tell us how they do each year. So we do yearly check-ins, and we offer them support. We offer them, kind of things like, kind of sessions with their peers, or, kind of information to help them do that, make that transition. And, over the years, we've now got 180 members. We have all of the big 6 advertising agency groups as members. We have, kind of brands such as Haleon. We have British Gas, for example, various others who are also doing the same thing. And the idea is, brands, they essentially have the power. So we ask brands to put requirements for CAN in all of the briefs and RFPs that go out to their agencies, so that their agencies and their vendors have to think about kind of human rights and climate as part of the planning that they do to make and to place that advertising.
Now, I think for a lot of our audience, because obviously we focus more on sustainability and looking at things like clean energy and the living wage and, addressing climate change and new technologies, it's slightly terrifying to think about the fact that the knowledge we have about the way the digital environment is changing is not accidental. It's the result of a sort of conglomeration of circumstances. It may be sort of anger and political upset, but it's also on the back of, as you say, the choice of spend, the way digital technology works. That to me is utterly fascinating when you consider that the EU just recently has agreed the basics for how companies should be held to account on their due diligence of their supply chains. And I think in a sense, it's easier for people to understand, okay, look at a supply chain. Is there slavery in your fishing lines, or is there massive land destruction in your food chain? The idea that this is in advertising as well just kind of completely blows my mind. How are you going about making this something that people understand more obviously?
That's a great question. And absolutely, if we think about, there is movement by the UN. The UN have created something called the Information Integrity kind of Code of Conduct, which is out for consultation at the moment. So this idea of our information ecosystems being polluted is so serious that it's being taken, it's being thought about at multilateral level. And, the same thing around the financing of content which could be harmful to children or which promotes hate, for example. All of these things are really serious, but they cross a lot of different sectors. If you work in sustainability, I think it would be a huge stretch to try and get your head around, actually what this looks like. And yet, I'm an environmental scientist by training. And if I look at this information, it feels like pollution to me, pollution in our information environment. And so actually, I think what we do need is we need people from cross sectors with all sorts of different skills who are leaning into some of these issues. And I think this new, I think the EU is doing brilliant stuff around kind of, making sure that corporate organizations are embedding human rights and embedding that kind of thinking into their operations. So we do a lot of work trying to unpick this and explain this to people. We work a lot with organizations such as Check My Ads, who've kind of coined this phrasing around the disinformation economy to help people to understand. And we're working a lot with our members as well to unpick some of these issues and to help them not only to talk about the problems, because the problems are grave, but also to think about the solutions. And I think for anyone who's listening, anyone who doesn't necessarily understand this, is that, like you said, we've put a lot of work into thinking about our physical supply chains and asking, is there harm in our physical supply chains? And yet we've not necessarily done the same for our digital ones. So, we have some simple questions in our manifestos that we ask members to ask themselves. And it's things like, are you funding hate and misinformation? Are you defunding quality content about important issues? Is your advertising appearing next to content which could be harmful to children? All these kind of things. And obviously this isn't a conscious decision by most advertisers. They're not thinking, I really want to appear next to terrorist content. But because they're not asking the right questions and because they're not working with the right, they're not asking the right questions of their partners and their vendors, this is where these problems happen. And you also have bad actors who know this very, very well and are taking full advantage of it. There is, if anyone wants to read up on what happened during the 2016 American elections and wants to know about Macedonian teenagers creating disinformation farms and getting very rich off it, I mean, that's a Google search you never thought you'd have to do.
Actually, if you've got a link for that, I'd love to add that to the show notes, because this is just, it's this fascinating disconnect between passive and active harm, and how you can actually be collaborating in harm without even knowing that you're doing it.
Yes, and that's part of the reason for the word conscious in our name, because a lot of these harms are happening because you just aren't aware. And it's another one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I will happily, for readers out there who are thinking, gosh, this is vast, I can happily kind of send some links through, because this is a whole new area of kind of protection, an area of kind of supply chain due diligence that we collectively really need to be thinking about. And one of our, I think one of the things that we're keen is that, people in organizations at CMO level, at C-suite level, are seeing this as something that needs to be on their risk register. I saw a piece of research from Kantar, I think a couple of weeks ago, which suggested that only 6% of organizations had misinformation, disinformation on their risk register. And yet it's something that the World Economic Forum has claimed is going to be one of the biggest risks to society over the next not only 2 years, but also 10 years. So these are big, big issues that we need to be getting a handle on.
I mean, one of the things that springs to mind is that while I can understand that companies can do more about ad spend, this issue of ad tech is much more complicated. I mean, is there technology out there that companies can work with that deliberately does the opposite? Or I'm afraid I don't know enough about the ad technology system. But how much of that is just that everything that's available doesn't address harms?
That's a great question. So if you let me kind of like put this into context around scale, because if I'm a large organization, say I'm a Unilever or I'm a Procter and Gamble, for example, I'm advertising in all over the world. And not only am I advertising all over the world, but I'm also advertising to specific kind of segments of consumers. If you walk into any of these organizations, you'll have your washing powder customers will all be different. Your DAS customers are going to be different to your personal customer, for example, and who you're targeting. So this is a very complicated kind of digital marketing ecosystem for these organizations. And what they do is they employ advertising technology to make this happen at scale. But the problem is, when you're thinking about the open web, actually 15 years ago, you and I might have gone on the open web and we might have gone to, 30 different websites regularly. And in fact, our journeys through the web look like a series of kind of B roads, or, to traverse this enormous space. Now, actually, it's more like a series of motorways, because actually you've now got platforms who host content. So, for example, YouTube will host lots of video content from lots of creators. And so you've actually changed the way that we use the internet. I mean, you have these kind of highways and these kind of and these places that people go to. And then there will still be websites that we go to, but there will be fewer of them. And I think they're probably easier to predict. Now, what you've got is all these a lot of these B roads are sites that are created either by bad actors to deceive or made for advertising sites. And you get a lot of kind of junk down these B roads, sadly now. And so if you are trying to advertise on the whole of the open web, you're exposing yourself to a lot of risk, because you're going down all of these B roads. And even the best AI technology, even the best AI kind of brand, they call it brand safety technology, which tries to stop advertising appearing in the wrong places. Even the best cannot understand everything. I always use the thing that some AI is still trying to work out whether pictures are a dog or a muffin. And it's kind of the same in, kind of like these language technologies. These big AI models cannot work out, for example, if a community is using a word because it's a slur, or they're using a word that's a reclaimed word, for example. It's all these areas where this technology and it doesn't get sarcasm, it doesn't get satire. So, so actually one of the best things advertisers can do is insert human thinking into this whole process, and kind of go where, and that's what our manifestos suggest, is that actually you should start going to yourself, what do we actively want to fund? And how can we seek ways of appearing there? And that might be quality content. It might be making sure that we're showing up on content from diverse communities, for example. And then where really don't we want to be? Where is the risk too high that we're going to be ending up on some stuff that's that's not great. That's not great for our brand, for example. That's not great for society. And then, you reduce the risk because they're in the middle. You can start to apply some of that. You can start to apply that technology that supposedly keeps your brand safe, but comes with risks. There's that side of things. And then there's also, advertisers have huge consumer power when it comes to the platforms. So, we hear a lot about, kind of unsavory content on places like Instagram or TikTok or kind of YouTube. Advertisers also can not only choose where they show up there and need to, kind of really, really carefully, but also they can also talk to the platforms and, kind of like wield quite large power because advertisers are their consumers. The platforms, kind of want to please their customers, but there's also a tension with those platforms between keeping people on there for longer, which often involves keeping, kind of feeding them some of this kind of
clickbait and irritation and arguments.
Exactly. And exactly. There's that kind of like less great content because that'll make them more money and also pleasing advertisers and also making sure that there's essentially that there is pluralistic and diverse information out there. So it's an interesting one, but advertisers kind of do need to kind of lean into some of these tricky conversations because ultimately, otherwise, you end up with a media environment that's either incredibly polluted or, if they're too risk averse, just full of cat videos and nothing else.
Well, listening to you, it sort of begins to feel as if any advertiser worth their salt that wants to be seen to be a positive contributor to society has got to start being an active actor in the media environment, and that passive engagement is no longer sufficient.
I think that's absolutely the case. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, so I think one of the big questions then becomes, what are the biggest challenges you faced in trying to get brands to understand this and engage?
I think one of the biggest challenges is it's not very well understood. I think that if you particularly, as we said, if you're an ethical brand, it's really, you've often done a lot of work into your supply chains and into making sure that the vendors, the partners you work with share your values. That becomes much more difficult in kind of like when you're considering advertising in the round. I think it's, again, you'll have a lot of organizations that really have put a lot of thought into what appears on screen, but maybe this media side of things is a new conversation. So I think we've got a job to do in kind of simplifying and unpicking this stuff to make it, and also to kind of packaging it up in ways that different parts of different businesses can really pick up on. And I know that, some of our most successful members, what they've done really well is they've brought together not just people from the marketing function, but also people from sustainability, from the leadership, all sorts of different functions together to go, how can we embed this kind of thinking across our organization? So I think that for us is a huge challenge.
That I think is fascinating, again, because of its connection to this approach, this very 21st century approach, which is recognizing that none of our ecosystem functions, none of our business functions, nothing happens in isolation, and there's interconnections between everything else. So one of the most powerful things you can do is actually connect across these silos and look at impacts and interactions. What I think comes out of this for me is what do you see in the market? Do you see a shift towards a better understanding of the power of advertising and what it can do? Or do you see the algorithms taking over?
I see a lot of increasingly motivated people in this space and increasingly knowledgeable and good storytellers, because that's also what we need. I also see a lot of people just leaning into new technologies without necessarily asking themselves questions. And I know, the use of artificial intelligence is a huge debate across industries. Is it going to be net positive? Is it going to be, leave us all with no jobs? Is it going to kind of, decimate humanity? And the reality obviously is going to be somewhere in between. But I do think advertising technology has created funding models for the worst hate and disinformation that is undermining democracy. And that is from a technology that was designed to essentially auction off parts of our browsing experience to show us ads. So I do think that we have to think very, very carefully about how we're picking up complex technologies, and we do need to apply, that kind of human rights and climate kind of climate lens to a lot of this stuff, because we don't know. 15 years ago, the creators of the first advertising technology couldn't have known that it would have these side effects. but we're not asking ourselves the same questions about the AI technologies that we're embedding, frankly, right now. And they are much more complex. So for me, I am somewhere in between being in awe of this kind of big movement of people who are starting to really get this and to really, embed really great practices or campaign around this. On the other side, I am very scared by the way that we just have moved on, moved on to kind of embedding AI technologies very quickly. And we know that they are limited. So I'm somewhere in between an optimist and a pessimist.
Well, I have to say that this conversation has been eye-opening for me, and I think there is growing concern, and I see it in a lot of the conversations I have about the impact on democracy of what's going on online. And again, it comes back to this idea of you need to think about the consequences of your actions, and that's a lot of what's under discussion in the sustainability world. So, on that note, Harriet, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been utterly fascinating. I will add some details in the show notes to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed listening to information about how the world underneath the hood may look very different than you expect. As ever, you can subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcasts, and we'll be back soon.